Billy Graham in the Chicago Stadium. Carmen Basilio in his corner. And there's Billy Graham, rather casual. The 25-year-old Carmen Basilio is in black trunks. Billy Graham, 5 years Carmen Sr., is wearing white. A good showing tonight would give Basilio a chance to gain a place in the world welterweight ranking. A native of Canastota, New York, Carmen has been boxing professionally since 1948. Even though a veteran of 41 professional fights, this will be Basilio's first major fight. #1 contender Billy Graham hopes to ensure his chances for a title bout with welterweight champion Kid Gavilan. Billy Graham sharpshooting. The more experienced Graham took rounds 2 through 5. For Billy, tonight will be his 113th professional bout in a career that spans 11 years, beginning in 1941. Defeating close to 100 opponents has made Graham the #1 contender for Gavilan's world welterweight title, and Billy hopes to meet the Kid this October. Graham boxing beautifully. Round 7 was scored evenly, and here in round 8, Basilio is looking to take over. Thus far in his pro career, Carmen has scored 14 knockout victories and shows great promise of moving up the welterweight ladder. Basilio in black trunks is taking on a great pro this evening. Graham's boxing experience gained him the 9th round, and it looks as if he'll get the judge's decision. Billy has been boxing brilliantly for 30 minutes. There's the bell ending the fight. Carmen Basilio gave a very strong showing, but Billy Graham's the winner. He'll be seeing more of Carmen Basilio, though. It's September 7th, 1955. 3 years and 22 bouts later, Carmen Basilio has become the world welterweight champion by knocking out Tony DeMarco in Syracuse. Now that he's the welterweight king, Basilio is campaigning for a shot at the 160-pound middleweight crown as he meets 10th-ranked middleweight contender Gil Turner. Basilio is in the black trunks and Turner is wearing white. Going into this bout, Carmen has a winning streak of 13 straight. The last man to defeat Carmen Basilio was former welterweight king Kid Gavilan, who won a very close decision over Basilio 2 years ago. But Gil Turner is a dangerous puncher, having knocked out 33 of his 57 opponents. Basilio pouring it on. Carmen dominated rounds 2 through 7, but the fight is still close and up for grabs. Gil has opened up a serious gash over Carmen's right eye. Gil Turner has been coming on here in round 8. Both men giving 100%. Sharp punches by both fighters. Neither man will take a backward step. Basilio took the 9th round, and here in the 10th and final round, it looks as if the hard-punching New York State onion farmer, Carmen Basilio, is going to have his 14th straight victory. fighters very strong here in the 10th and final round. A sensational finish to this great fight. Referee Ruby Goldstein watching the action very closely. And there's the bell ending the fight. The judges award a close decision to Carmen Basilio. Carmen is elated. It's November 30th, 1955, and Carmen Basilio defends his World Welterweight Championship for the first time against the man he took it from, Tony DeMarco. Both fighters warming up prior to round one. Champion Carmen Basilio is wearing the white trunks. Challenger and former champion Tony DeMarco is in black. Basilio is undefeated in more than 2 years, but in the last 2 World Welterweight title fights, the champions have lost their titles on their first defense. All told, 11 World Welterweight champions have lost their titles the first time that they put them on the line. DeMarco in black trunks is a brilliant boxer slugger. This is a rugged first round for a bout that's scheduled to go 15. Champion Basilio took the lead in rounds 2 through 5. Basilio, a 28-year-old ex-Marine, won the title from DeMarco in a sensational bomb-throwing brawl last June. Both weighed in at 147 pounds, but Carmen stands in an inch taller. In their first meeting, Basilio's savage body attack wilted DeMarco after the 7th round, and Tony lost on a TKO in the 12th. Last April, DeMarco, in black trunks, met Johnny Saxton in Boston and won the World Championship from Saxton on a 14th round KO. In his first defense of the title, he lost it to Basilio. Basilio is staggered here at the end of the 6th round. DeMarco is coming on. Round 7 was hard fought and very close. Here in the 8th, everyone's guessing what's going to happen next. DeMarco is throwing bombs. Basilio is in trouble. Tony wants that World Championship back. Carmen Basilio is a natural southpaw. In rounds 9 through 11, Basilio continued to pour it on and is ahead on points going into the 12th round. It's all Basilio here in the 12th round. Tony is in trouble. Basilio pouring it on. Carmen throwing lefts and rights. A savage right puts DeMarco on the canvas. The referee picks up the count. Courageously, DeMarco is trying to get to his feet and beats the count. Basilio moves in to end it. Lefts and rights to the jaw, and the referee steps in and stops the fight. DeMarco is out. It's a TKO victory for champion Carmen Basilio in 1 minute and 54 seconds of the 12th round. Carmen stopped DeMarco exactly 2 seconds earlier in their first fight. Basilio has once again proved that he's the best welterweight in the world. Basilio throwing kisses to the crowd. They're trying to revive Tony in his corner. A sensational knockout victory for the great welterweight champion, Carmen Basilio.
Nearly 40,000 fans in Yankee Stadium and all eyes on the ring as announcer Johnny Addy introduces the two contestants.
Main event, 15 rounds for the middleweight championship of the world. Introducing from Chittenango, New York, wearing black trunks, weighing 153.5 pounds, the welterweight champion of the world, Carmen Basilio. His opponent from New York City, wearing white trunks, weighing 160, middleweight king, Sugar Ray Robinson. 15 rounds for the middleweight championship of the world.
The middleweight champion, taller, heavier, and 6 years older than Basilio, begins the first round, as he will every succeeding one, shooting out jabs. Basilio sets a pattern too, weaving, crouching, trying to get in and under. The fight starts carefully, as it must. Neither of these fighters has met in the ring before. They're simply exploring, feeling each other out. The third man in the ring is referee Al Burrow. Was fairly even. By now, they're beginning to open up. Before this round is over, Basilio will land some of those hooks for which he's famous, and Sugar will counter just as beautifully. Already you can sense what a perfect match this is. These two men are masters at their trade. Here's a nice close-up. Robinson stinging in those jabs. Basilio trying to get in close with those wicked hooks. Round 5, it's been a pretty even match. Basilio's been cut over his left eye and still a target for Sugar Ray. But Carmen has been taking his toll, too, with body punches that can hurt a man. Every time he gets in to land a hook, you can sense the reaction. Basilio, as always, is forcing the fight. You can see that left eye of his bleeding again. Pulls them apart. There have been few clinches. Rolling into round 9, it almost seems time for an explosion. By now, almost everyone figured the climax would come. A sudden series of punches that might spell doom for either fighter. Both men are in superb condition. Both men are dishing it out and staying in there. Basilio still has that patch over his left eye. Notice how he continues to force the fight, although just a little bit slower. And Robinson, watching like a hawk, always looking for that split-second opening, eager to uncork his combinations. Of actual fighting have gone by. Neither man has really taken over, but this is the round that will be the fiercest of them all. Before it's over, we'll see the fastest, hardest exchanges of the entire fight. Watch closely. Basilio has him on the ropes. 30 seconds left in the round. Round number 12, and again one of the climactic rounds of this great fight. Once more, those opening jabs by Robinson. Sugar Ray's just a bit slower, but he's shaken off that battering he took in the previous round. Basilio weaving, crouching, always aggressive. He's loaded with confidence after that last round. But watch Robinson show his dynamite. Left in this sensational battle for the middleweight championship of the world. Sugar Ray, sharpest shooting puncher of the modern ring, and Carmen Basilio taking everything he's got and hammering back all the way. Robinson Basilio is going after, but he's dead game. Watch those hooks get through. Nearly over. It's time for Robinson to stage his last-minute throw. Round 14, and each of these champions is calling upon everything he's got. For round after round, they've traded punches in one of the greatest fights in this division. Neither man has scored a knockdown, yet both of them have power enough to pull it off with a single punch. Both men are showing their weariness. Here we go for the final round. Through it all, both Robinson and Basilio have dueled like champions. With just 3 minutes left, Basilio is still the aggressor. Robinson, who figured to have it tougher if the fight went as long as this, is gamely hanging on, mouth open, jabbing all the time and tying Carmen up in the clinches. Seconds to go. There's the bell, and the big fight is over. Both Sugar Ray Robinson and Carmen Basilio deserve tremendous credit. Each is responsible for one of the truly great fights of our time. But now it's all up to the ring officials appointed by the New York State Athletic Commission. Here's announcer Johnny Addy with their decision.
Judge Adi Idala scores it 9-5, 1 even, Basilio. Referee Al Burl scores it 9-6, Robinson. The other judge, Bill Recht, scores it 8-6, 1 even. The winner and new middleweight champion of the world, Carmen Basilio.
The champion from Canastota, New York, Carmen Basilio.
Basilio was that good that he had problems. The fight game wasn't always honest.
You faked the knockout, isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Quit that dirty, rotten game, she says.
I think boxing is the swill barrel of sport.
Racketeers controls the so-called sport of boxing.
Frankie Carbo was a professional hitman.
Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray, that's what they called him.
He killed many, many people.
The Underworld Commissioner of Boxing.
I respectfully decline to answer questions on the ground that I cannot be compelled to be a witness against myself.
The mob made life difficult for Carmen because they couldn't control him. They didn't want him to win.
The winner and new middleweight champion of the world.
He was in a very, very difficult spot.
His managers were particularly close to Carbo and to Gabe Genovese.
They made me think I was the biggest criminal around. I was never a mafia man. Johnny came to me and he says, I'm going to have to hook up with the mob in order for you to get a championship fight. And I refused to give anything up.
They started to refer to Basilio as the man of courage.
Carmen Basilio was born and grew up in Canastota, New York. And out of Canastota, New York, there's a narrow highway that runs northwest to Oneida Lake. And about 4 miles out of town, there are what used to be called the mucklands. And they used to go out and pick onions in these mucklands.
You know, it's a rich black soil, but in the summer sun, it can burn your hands and burn your feet. And the weather was very temperamental. I mean, you could lose a whole year's crop in a single July afternoon when the hail came, and you could sometimes literally see it coming down the rows in the field.
left to walk and eat, you had to work. Everybody worked. It was a job for everybody on the farm.
And they would live right there and get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, whole families of people, kids and everybody, on their hands and knees, working in onions.
We hated it. We were kids. Who wants to work when you're a kid?
One day, he said, I finally had it. I had done a little fighting, and I stood up and I said to my pa, Pa, I'm quitting. He said, what are you gonna do? I said, I'm gonna be a fighter. And he said, you'll take many a beating. And I said, yeah, and I'll give many a beating too.
My father was a boxing nut. He followed all of the fights. I remember we were little kids, and my father was going to go with a couple of his paisans to Syracuse, New York. Primo Carnera was going to box an exhibition there. You take those old Italians, and one of their paisans was champion of the world. That's one of the most thrilling things in the world for them.
I think when Primo Carnera won the heavyweight championship of the world, it may have been one of the only times that heavyweight championship was fixed. The poor fight game suffered more, I think, from being manipulated by the dark forces, whatever they are, than any other sport.
Gamblers and profiteers had long had their hands in boxing, but by the mid-30s, the fight game had been wholly taken over by the underworld.
After Prohibition, the mob looked for a new source of revenue. It had controlled boxing pretty thoroughly during Prohibition, but now they needed to go big time. And boxing was a great place to start, and it controlled it absolutely thoroughly.
The really big-time racketeer to enter the boxing game was Oni Madden, who was a prime bootlegger in the 20s. Somehow or another got the contract of Jack Sharkey.
They always own a piece of the champion, and own him meant they would get a percentage of his purses, and they could decide who he would fight. And the pattern was you don't let him fight anybody who you don't already have an interest in.
If anyone could succeed at swindling prize fighters, it was Paul John Carbo, alias Frank Fortunati, alias Frank Tucker, alias Jimmy the Wop.
Frank Carbo was a guy who came up in the Bronx, whose childhood was one petty scam after another, and then he started killing people for a living, linked to Murder Incorporated and all the great mobsters of Brooklyn.
His first homicide was a case where he was shaking down cab drivers in the Bronx. One cab driver was recalcitrant, and Carbo killed him. 4 years he was in hiding. Then he came back and pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He got a 2.5-year sentence.
Frankie Carbo earned his stripes in the Vito Genovese crime family, and his status rose quickly. In 1936, Vito rewarded Carbo with a stake in his cousin Gabe's middleweight champion, Babe Briscoe.
And Genovese says to him, look, I like you, Frankie. You've been loyal, you've been good. Why don't you say, take 20% of his fighter? So what happened was that within 6 months, Carbo figured 100% is better than 20%, and Carbo had 100%, and that was his first fighter.
From there, he began to get more and more into boxing, and he became the underworld commissioner of boxing.
If you said Carbo to someone in boxing, they'd go like this. Mr. Gray, Mr. Gray. That's what they called him, Mr. Gray.
Carmen Basilio knew little of the gray-haired Frankie Carbo. Clean-cut, 21, and fresh out of the Marines, Basilio had one thing on his mind, earning a living.
Somebody said to me, you want to make 50 bucks? I said, how do you do that? He said, fight a professional fight in Binghamton, New York. I said, yeah. So I turned pro, went down and had my first pro fight in Binghamton, New York, and I won by TKO in the 3rd round. After about my 3rd or 4th pro fight, I come home and my eye was all black and blue and closed. My mother, she had a fit. You quit that dirty, rotten game, she says.
Mary Basilio was more astute than she knew. By the late 1940s, New York District Attorney Frank Hogan had waged war on racketeering. He thought he struck gold the night Jake LaMotta gave up against Billy Fox.
LaMotta was a wonderful fighter that couldn't get the title shot that he wanted. And the mob came to him and said, look, you play ball with us, and you get the shot. At the time, the mob was building up a guy by the name of Billy Fox. Turned out to be not that great of a fighter.
Billy Fox had a record of 43 consecutive knockouts, all fixed, I would imagine.
So LaMotta said, okay, if I get the fight, I'll take the dive.
But I remember Dan Parker writing, said that the sound of splashing water was heard in Madison Square Garden last night, you know, as LaMotta took his dive.
Here's a guy who knew the difference between right and wrong then, but it didn't influence him very much.
Besides the promise of a title shot, LaMotta allegedly received a $100,000 bribe, but District Attorney Hogan had no proof. To the dismay of big-time Broadway bookmakers, Frankie Carbo and other mobsters made a killing on the fight. The scam caused enough of a stink that the New York Boxing Commission fined LaMotta $1,000 and suspended him indefinitely.
LaMotta was a street kid. Grew up in Lower East Side, went to the Bronx, fended for himself. Basilio, you know, grew up in Canastota, New York. Had a family, upbringing, do the right thing, and he didn't have to look toward the mobsters.
Carmen Basilio was a man with honor, a man of integrity. I always thought of him as the honest onion farmer.
In 1950, Carmen Basilio was struggling to find himself as a fighter. He had broken his hand in a bout, and his career was on hold.
And I got a job to work for the Autolite company, assembling generators. And one day I'm working, and I look back there, and there's my boss staring at me, and I said to myself, am I going to spend the rest of my life having that boss looking at me? No way. I said, I'm making a comeback.
Basilio hooked up with a couple of Syracuse area managers, John DeJohn and Joe Nitro. Nitro was well connected, and DeJohn was shrewd enough to turn Carmen into a fighter.
Well, I was a rough, tough walking sort of a guy, slugger, winding up my punches, telegraphing them and everything, and he made me put all that away and start all over again from scratch.
Basilio learned fast and soon became the terror of the welterweight division. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to clash with boxing's biggest force, the International Boxing Club, the brainchild of Chicago lawyer Truman Gibson, Gibson's friend and client Joe Louis, and New Jersey press agent Harry Mendel.
After the war, when Louis was going to retire from the title, Gibson came up with the idea that they could turn Louis's heavyweight title into an ongoing money machine in professional boxing.
The plan was that once Louis retired, an organization to promote fighters would be set up in his name.
We'd produce for Joe's corporation 4 fights. We would assign the fighters to Joe Louis Enterprises, and we would sell the contracts to a new corporation. Harry Mendel said, I know a crazy young Irish guy, Coral Gables, who would be interested in getting in the fight business. So he called Jim Norris at 4 o'clock in the morning. Jim said, well, I'm, you know, a little drunk now, but come out tomorrow morning and we'll talk about it.
Jim Norris was a blue blood who owned companies and businesses in many different fields, an accomplished sportsman, and a big-time gambler.
He had a big racing stable, Spring Hill Farms. He had a couple of horses in the Derby. He would call to see how his horses were doing, and have to read the sports page to him every morning at 7 o'clock. The New York tracks. That's where Norris got his relationship and kinship with guys in the mob.
Acting on the advice of his partner, Arthur Wirtz, Norris bought out Joe Louis for $150,000. In exchange, he got the contracts of the 4 top heavyweight contenders. Then, after arranging for Madison Square Garden to buy out its promoter, Mike Jacobs, Norris had a virtual monopoly on boxing promotion and a silent partner in Frankie Carbo.
You could not get a fight with the IBC unless Norris or Carbo sanctioned it, and they controlled the major arenas.
Jimmy Norris and Frankie Carbo, they were the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers of boxing, the perfect duo.
It was Milton Berle and boxing that sold the first television sets.
In the 50s, we had the regular Wednesday night fights.
The Wednesday night fights are on the air.
There were the garden fights.
Live from Madison Square Garden.
We put on maybe 170, 175 fights a year.
The IBC's first fight had come on June 15, 1949. The mob delivered on its promise to Jake LaMotta, and that night, LaMotta beat Marcel Cerdan for the middleweight crown. A week later, Ezzard Charles outpointed Jersey Joe Walcott to win Joe Louis's vacant title. The IBC had locked up boxing's two most lucrative belts, with Frankie Carbo controlling the other weight divisions.
The mob made life difficult for Carmen because they couldn't control him. They didn't want him to win.
But Basilio was winning, so much so that he became a star attraction on Ray Arcel's Saturday night fight card.
Ray Arcel gave a lot of fighters an opportunity. Ray was never an enemy in the sense that we worked together. He had some opponents among some of the other elements, but not ever with us.
Arcel had hoped to televise a non-title bout between Basilio and reigning welterweight champion Kid Gavilan. But John DeJohn wanted a title fight for Basilio and dove into the belly of the beast to get one.
I went to New York, I knowing where Carbo hung around. If you went to Carbo and you told him a story, he didn't promise you nothing. But a week or two later, you got what you asked for. Got a call to meet Jim Norris down in New York. She went down and I saw Jim Norris. So Jim Norris says, what's this, you want to make a fight up in Syracuse with Gavilan and Basilio? What kind of money can you draw up there with him? I said, that fight there, being conservative, I think we'll do $75,000.
Norris liked what he heard and outbid Ray Arcel for the fight. Basilio now had his first big break, a shot at Gavilan's welterweight title.
And I thought I won the fight, but they gave him the decision. At least I won the respect of the people that didn't give me a chance before. And Carmen surprised everybody when he put him down.
That same month, boxing was in for an even bigger surprise, only this one occurred outside the ring. The victim was Ray Arcel.
He was standing in front of a hotel in Boston, and all of a sudden he was hit from behind apparently by a lead pipe.
They wanted to send a message to people that wanted to buck the IBC and the underworld, that if you got in our way, you were going to get hurt.
He just thought it wasn't worth it after that to stay in boxing, that he would be a target again.
The Saturday night fights went off the air and Ray Arcel disappeared from boxing for 18 years. Carbo's stranglehold on the sport was as solid as a ring post, and Carmen Basilio was headed straight for it.
I think boxing is the swill barrel of sports. It's a dirty racket in many instances, and that's the way it's going to be. As long as a hoodlum figures he can make a buck by muscling into it.
I had to hang around till June of 1955 before I got another shot at the welterweight championship.
First of all, if you're a real good fighter, the word gets around pretty quickly, and most people don't want to fight you. And some of the real good fighters who might have had connections or controls, their managers or the people in control didn't want them to fight Basilio.
Basilio had no connections. He didn't want to be one of Frankie Carbo's fighters. He knew how things worked, how Carbo was pulling strings on his puppet managers, guys like Blinky Palermo, Rip Valenti, Jaime Wallman, and Bernie Glickman.
You can go on and on and on. People just fronting for Carbo.
Because he had the one conviction for homicide. He couldn't get a license in his own name to manage fighters anymore.
What Carbo was interested in was controlling you as a fighter. The only way you can get a championship fight is to sign a personal service contract with Carbo, which means if you win, then Carbo will receive percentages of all of your championship fights. If you lose, it doesn't matter because he already receives percentages from the person who defeated you.
Under Carbo's control, Kid Gavilan held the welterweight title for almost 5 years. But by 1954, he was showing signs of wear and tear, and the mob found new blood in Johnny Saxton.
Carbo had, in essence, both fighters, Saxton and Gavilan. It was a god-awful fight, and the decision was given to Saxton.
With the advent of Sports Illustrated in the mid-50s, boxing became a weekly target of crusading journalists. The daily press, on the other hand, seemed to fall into two camps.
You wouldn't believe how many sports writers would besieged with gifts, quote, unquote, at Christmas time, or some would get a handout every week.
These regular beat writers would line up at the Garden after every Friday night fight and then would receive handouts and cash.
One day, LaMotta went down to the boxing commission to try to get his license back. So as we came out, LaMotta was with Al Silvani, who was then representing him. And Al Silvani said, "No, just a minute, Bill." I said, "What?" And he stuck out this $20 bill. He said, "Jake wants you to have it." I said, "You tell Jake." And I said, "No, I'll tell Jake." I said, "Let me tell you something, Jake. I'm insulted. I'm insulted for two reasons. Number one, you try to buy me, and number two, you try to buy me for $20.
Of the writers who could not be bought, none put up a more vigorous or more eloquent attack on the mob in boxing than Dan Parker.
For the whole decade of the 1950s, Dan Parker crusaded week after week against these gangsters.
Dan Parker was the person directly responsible for the Gabe Genovese case, the first case of a manager being convicted of undercover managing.
Carmen Basilio's managers knew what Genovese could do for their fighter. What they didn't know was how Carmen would respond.
Johnny came to me when I was the #1 welterweight, and he says, "I'm going to have to hook up with the mob in order for you to get a championship fight." I had to satisfy people, otherwise I wouldn't have got nothing. He said, "You're going to have to give up some of your percentage of your pay." I said, "No way. I'll get my shot, whether I give it to them or not, and I'm not giving it to them." He said, "Well, you're never going to get a shot." I said, "Well, time will tell." And I refused to give anything up. Now, whether they did or not, that's their business. I don't know. Genevieve's done a service for me, and I paid him.
Now that his managers had taken in Genovese, Basilio was in the mix. He was part of a round robin with Johnny Saxton and Tony DeMarco, who were set to meet for the welterweight crown.
A jolting left hook sends Saxton sideways. DeMarco then pours 17 straight punches to the champion's head.
He hit that poor Saxton, and he got caught in the ropes in the corner. He couldn't go down. And DeMarco hit him, I don't know how many shots. Like he was hitting the speed bag. Bang, bang, bang.
I've been fighting since I was like 11 years old, boys clubs, and always dreaming to be a champion. Always dreaming to be a professional fighter, and now I'm a champion.
A couple days after this tremendous upset victory, DeMarco says, "My left hand is still sore, I can't fight."
But DeMarco had signed a contract. His manager, Rip Valenti, made sure he kept up his end of the bargain, and in 70 days he was to meet Basilio for the title.
They couldn't deny me. They had to give me a title fight eventually. I was confident that I would win the title, but it wasn't easy.
June 10, 1955, Carmen Basilio challenges Tony DeMarco for the welterweight championship of the world.
It was a savage fight, absolutely savage. It was just a pure six brawl.
It was a tough fight, hard. He had knocked me down once.
The champion goes down.
I just couldn't lay back and let him set the pace. I had to keep forcing him, make him move, make him work. Eventually, it caught up with him. I ran him out of gas, and I started nailing him.
And the challenger, Basilio, is ripping into him with all he's got. That's all. The referee referee stops the fight at 1 minute and 52 seconds of the 12th round. Carmen Basilio wins the welterweight championship of the world.
He said, I'll never forget it. I just cried in the corner. I did it, I did it, I did it, he said. And his mother climbed into the ring and she kissed her son.
I was afraid she'd get hurt. Trip coming through the ropes or something, because she's such a short little thing. She's only 4'10".
She explained to me, she said, you know, we worked so hard. I said, what dreams did you have? She said, we had no dreams. What could we dream about the way we lived? And that was behind that embracing scene when he won the title.
After the DiMarco fight, they started to refer to Basilio as the man of courage.
Oh, he's a champion of the world, Carmen, right? So Blinky's after me. He wants a Saxton fight now, see? Because round robin, see? So I'm down in New York with Gabe Genovese, and we're at a Gallagher Steakhouse. We're having dinner. Blinky's there. So Blinky's going, well, come on, Pally, what are you going to do here? What are we going to do? Well, he goes, I'll tell you what. We'll take $10,000 off the gate. See, I'm learning now, understand? We'll give it to you, and we'll go in Boston and fight Tony DiMarco. We'll have a sellout over there. We'll all make money. Yeah, it's a good idea. He said, all right. So that's how we got the second fight in Boston.
A 15-round World's Welterweight Championship bout, matched by the International Boxing Club, James D. Norris, president, between the champion, Carmen Basilio of Canastota, New York, and the challenger, Tony DiMarco of Boston, Massachusetts. 30 seconds to go in the 7th round, and a smacking left hook, and Carmen Basilio's knees are of rubber. DiMarco trying to put across the big one.
He staggered me in the 7th round with a good left hook. I saw that punch coming from a mile away, never made an attempt to block it or get out of the way.
I hit him flush. His eyes rolled over his head and his knees crossed, and I waited for him to go down. He didn't go down.
I just said, don't go down, don't go down. You're in Boston. If you go down, they'll stop the fight without even counting. And I just fought it and moved and moved and moved, and then I just worked my way around. So the bell rang, I just turned around and sat down. I was in my own corner.
Basilio regained his senses and took control, flooring DiMarco twice and finally draining the life out of him.
This fight a duplicate of the one last June the 10th, as Carmen Basilio smashes Tony DiMarco into a helpless condition to have the fight called to a halt in the 12th round on a TKO.
The winner and still welterweight champion of the world, Carmen Basilio.
Now that DiMarco had lost twice to Basilio, it was Johnny Saxton's turn to take his shot.
Carmen was offered the chance to fight Saxton in Chicago. There was no clause in it for a rematch. So I think really reluctantly, he went to Chicago to fight Saxton.
I was never comfortable in Chicago.
On fight night, Basilio was a 2-to-1 favorite, but referee Frank Gilmer reminded him of why Chicago wasn't his kind of town.
He wouldn't let me fight inside where I was strongest, and he let Saxton do the running to keep us apart. And then in the 4th round, he'd come out, and the stuffing was coming out of his glove.
Saxton's glove got ripped after Carmen really hurt him, and for some reason they couldn't find another glove for 15 or 20 minutes.
When he recovered and ran like a deer for the rest of the fight, there was a little hanky-pank going on in that deal.
The judge's decision goes to Johnny Saxton.
I remember him telling me that he left Chicago with a broken heart.
Back in New York, Basilio secured a rematch. Behind the scenes, the usual greasing of the palms took place when Gabe Genovese collected from Basilio's managers and from the fight's promoter, Norm Rothschild.
Most boxing experts agree that Basilio's biggest asset is his excellent physical condition.
Still bitter from his defeat, Basilio trained harder than ever. This time out against Saxton, he would leave no doubt about the winner. Basilio had mended his broken heart, taking back the title from Saxton and the mob. Jim Norris made a mint on the fight, but his control over boxing was about to crack. In 1957, Jim Norris ran into a roadblock when a New York federal court found the IBC in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it to dissolve.
Bob, all I can say is we're naturally disappointed with the decision. Do you plan to make any appeal? That will be in the hands of our counsel. When we have the typed reports of the Judge Ryan's decree, we'll go over them point by point and then be advised by counsel.
With an appeal in the works, Norris went ahead with his next big fight. Carmen Basilio versus a man who was bigger, badder, and bolder than the mob, Sugar Ray Robinson.
Well, Sugar Ray was training to fight Jake LaMotta for LaMotta's world middleweight title in 1951. He was training up in Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. And the phone rang one day, and he answered it, and the voice said, "Ray?" He said, "Yes." He said, "This is Mr. Gray. I want to talk to you. I'll be down outside the gate in about half an hour." Ray said, "Okay." So he went down, and there was a big black sedan. The window came down, and Frankie Carbo's face was in the window, and he said, "Ray, I got a deal for you. You win the first fight, Jake wins the second, and the third will be on the level." And Ray said, "I'm sorry, I just don't do business that way."
Robinson and Basilio shared a loathing for the mob, but oddly enough, had little respect for one another.
He had an arrogance about him that I couldn't stand, so there was never any love between he and I. It was Labor Day weekend, 1952, and my wife had never been to New York City. We're walking down Broadway, this big Cadillac pulls up. It was Ray Robinson and his entourage. I walked over and I introduced myself, and they gave me the biggest brush off. And I felt so embarrassed, and I said, "I'm going to fight that son of a bitch and kick his ass someday." 5 years later, I finally got a crack at him.
Early in the afternoon, the welterweight champion heads into Alexandria Bay, a vacation village in the Thousand Islands region. He is a real local hero, and the people of this small town will all be at the fight en masse. Robinson won't win any popularity contests around Carmen's camp, since Basilio's end of the purse was cut 5% in order to meet Robinson's demand for a bigger guarantee.
Well, he's been a little bit greedy on his part, wanting all the money, and if I didn't come down 5%, the public that are entitled to a fight like this would have been deprived of it, so I came down 5% so that the people could see the fight.
Carmen was 5'6" and Robinson was 6 foot, which meant that Carmen had to punch up. And as you punch up, you lose power. So he had some real physical disadvantages going into that fight.
I had to put the pressure on him to keep him moving backwards, to keep him away from his punching power. So I had to move in all the time, punch to the body and come up to the head. I walked back to my corner at the end of the 15th round, and I says, "I won this fight."
The winner and new middleweight champion of the world, Carmen Basilio.
I got goose pimples all over me, and I got called. I almost started to cry, because I remember when I was in 4th grade, the teacher asked all of us children what they wanted to be when they grew up. And when they got to me, I said, "I'm going to be a professional fighter, and I'm going to be champion of the world." And she said, "That's the most disgusting thing I ever heard." And I was embarrassed to no end about it, but I never forgot it.
Basilio's victory against Sugar Ray Robinson lifted him into greatness. His title-winning fight at Yankee Stadium had brought in close to $1 million, and the rematch in Chicago promised even more thrills.
Carmen, and all the excitement after the weigh-in, just one question. I've polled 10 sports writers from around the nation here. 9 of them picked Sugar Ray to win by a knockout tonight. What's your answer to that?
9 of them are wrong.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you.
I was teaching him how to block a right uppercut and counter with a left hook. He slipped. He made a mistake.
He hit me with a right uppercut right here in the eyebrow. It broke the blood vessels open, and my eye blew up instantly.
I said, he got a bump like the size of an egg, and I could see Carmen's eye closing.
I couldn't see to my left. I had to work hard to change my stance a little bit.
Carmen kept going, don't stop this fight, don't stop the fight.
By now, 12 rounds have rolled past in this tremendous title match. Basilio hasn't been able to see out of that left eye of his since the 6th round. Sugar Ray is really looking for a chance to finish him off.
Sports Illustrated said that not 1 in 100 million men could have done what Basilio did that night.
The winner and the new world's middleweight champion, Sugar Ray Robinson.
The public wanted a third fight, and so did Frankie Carbo. But Carbo had gone into hiding in Miami after being indicted for illegal matchmaking. Even so, he sent for Basilio to talk about making Robinson 3.
He never told me what to do. Never gave me any orders. I wouldn't take them anyway, because I didn't believe in that stuff.
Basilio set the terms, and by God, he didn't fight Robinson unless those terms were met.
He wasn't satisfied with 350,000. He said because the other guy was getting 700, which in a way he was right.
The fight never come off, and it was at the time the hottest fight in boxing.
In 1959, Jim Norris's boxing empire lost its final appeal to stay in business. That year, the United States Supreme Court upheld a lower court's decision and ordered the dissolution of all IBC companies.
Wirtz and Norris' control over the Garden had to be broken up. They had to sell their shares in the Garden. Wirtz and Norris cried all the way to the bank because they got a tremendous return on their Garden shares.
3 months after the Supreme Court's ruling, the hunt for Frankie Carbo ended dramatically when police captured him in New Jersey.
They surrounded the place with guns drawn. Well, it turned out that Carbo had jumped out the back window, and he was immediately nailed there by the detectives from the DA's office.
Frank, the night you were arrested, you were going out the back door. You said you thought the Mafia was trying to rub you out. Why would they want to do that?
It turned out that Carbo thought it was a rub-out rather than a police action. So he was one frightened person.
He pled guilty. The most he could have gotten was, I think, 3 to 5 years, and he wound up getting 2 years.
Frankie Carbo was sent to Rikers Island Prison, where Gabe Genovese was also doing time for unlicensed managing. The mob's grip on boxing was coming loose. John DeJohn and Joe Nitro admitted to boxing officials they had made secret payments to Genovese and lost their licenses to manage in New York State. It would take almost 4 years before DeJohn was reinstated.
I got a bad break because that boxing commission ruined me, the New York Boxing Commission, when they banned me like that. They made me think I was the biggest criminal around. People, oh, yeah. Him? That's why I say I was a mafia man. I was never a mafia man. The evil was already there. I didn't create that evil. They had to have a scapegoat, so they grabbed me. Why? Because Basilio was the hottest thing at that time. It made news.
I think probably Nitro and DeJohn tried to do their best by Basilio. They did what they had to do to get him in the ring for a championship fight.
Basilio testified before the commission and told of his meeting with Carbo in Miami. Cleared of any wrongdoing, Basilio stood by his managers. We were together, Joe, John, and myself, for 8 years, and I can only say that I would never want anyone else to handle my affairs.
The thousands and thousands of pages of testimony and evidence on this table all point towards one inescapable conclusion, and that is that during the period from 1947 through 1960, racketeers and underworld figures dominated and controlled the so-called sport of professional boxing.
In the summer of 1960, Congress held hearings on criminal activity in the fight game. Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, who chaired the hearings, relied on John Bonamy to lay out the case for boxing reform.
LaMotta was the lead-off witness before the Kefauver committee. I asked him whether he had taken a dive in his fight with Billy Fox in 1947.
But you don't forget whether or not you faked the knockout, do you?
No, sir.
And that's the truth. You faked the knockout, isn't that correct?
Yes, sir. I received an offer of $100,000 to lose to Billy Fox, which I
refused. I said I was only interested in a championship fight.
Did your brother, Joseph LaMotta, state to you the persons who were offering the $100,000 bribe?
He did not.
He had said in preliminary testimony that the bribe offer came from Blinky Palermo, who was a leading manager at the time.
Several former boxers told of the need to clean up the very sport Mary Basilio had called the dirty, rotten game. Her son Carmen was among them.
They just don't have any respect for those fellas, and they don't belong in boxing, and the quicker we get those fellas out, the better it's going to be for the sport.
Here he was, you know, from a small town, a rural guy, and to speak up and to speak out, I think took a lot of courage.
Well, they told me, even my manager, he says, tell the truth. And I said, I intend to. If you don't, it'll come back to you.
Have you ever threatened any manager or boxer or promoter at any time within the last 10 years for not carrying out any wishes? Your wishes? I respectfully decline to answer the question on the ground that I cannot be compelled to be a witness against myself.
Carbo refused to tell the committee about his role as the underworld boss of boxing. Instead, he took the fifth 30 times.
There's only one thing I want to say, Mr. Senator. Okay. I congratulate you on your re-election.
The Kefauver hearing spawned a bill calling for federal control over boxing. The measure died in Congress when it received little support from Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Resisting the need for a national crime commission, Kennedy was less interested in policing the fight game than he was in convicting the racketeers associated with it.
Oh, he staggered Basilio! Basilio almost went down! Basilio's hurt. The round is almost over. The round is over.
The last couple of fights that I had, I would take my shower, get dressed, walk out of the gym, not talk to anybody. I was 34 years old, and I'm driving in my car, and I'm all by myself, but I'm thinking about this. And I said, Carmen, it's time to retire.
In 1961, Carmen Basilio fought his last fight, a valiant but losing bid for Paul Pender's middleweight title. By this time, the legal troubles of Frankie Carbo had escalated when he and 4 other defendants, Blinky Palermo, Truman Gibson, Louis Dragna, and Joseph Seeker, were tried in Los Angeles on charges of extortion and conspiracy.
There was bail set for Carbo on our charge of $100,000, which in those days was a very big bail. To give you an idea how big it was, I started working as a federal prosecutor for $4,250 a year.
The government's key witness was West Coast matchmaker Jackie Leonard. Leonard had promoted the welterweight title fight between Virgil Akins and Don Jordan, and then refused to give up a piece of Jordan. When the mob came to collect, Leonard was attached to a pair of FBI wiretaps.
Carbo called Leonard cross-country and told him he was going to come out there to the West Coast and gouge out his eyes.
I went to work for the Genesee Brewing Company out of Rochester, New York. And within a week after that, I had a telephone call from the athletic director at Lemoyne College, and they offered me a job there as a phys ed teacher.
Basilio had gone back to a simple life, far from the arenas where he had pounded out a living with his fists, farther still from the dark forces he had battled outside the ring.
Camus has a character in one of his novels say that sanctity and heroism don't matter to me. What interests me is in being a man. And I think Carmen Basilio is a man, a good man.
Carmen and I, we got close because many times we were together in different events, and we became friends. My son was 14 years old. He died from a car accident. Basilio, he heard about it, and for respect that he had for me, he came to Boston. He stayed with us. He came to the funeral with us. And that was, I'll never forget him.
Basilio was a great fighter, had all the bravery and grit that we all like to see in a fighter.
He was ferocious in the ring. He was humble enough to kneel in the ring. He was man enough to cry in the ring. Tony DeMarco probably said it best. At their 30th reunion of the night that Basilio won the welterweight championship of the world, over the years, I've come to understand that I couldn't have lost to a better fighter or a better human being than Carmen Basilio.